Now we're going to use what we've learned about arrays, about looping, about some of the methods that are available on an array, and we're going to try and solve a realistic programming problem on the web. And our program is defined as this. Allow the user to input a set of numbers separated by spaces. When the user clicks the button, sum the numbers. And we're going to ignore input that's not numbers. So it sounds like there's a lot of pieces to that, and what we're going to do is we're going to break this down and start one step at a time. So the first step that we're going to have to deal with is actually the HTML part of the input. So let's begin there. So the first thing is we need to create an input field that will allow a user to type some numbers. And we can see that here we go. Now I've got a label and I've got a plain old input field with an ID. And the specification speaks about a button. So I'm going to need to have a button. And so now I've created just a div, and I've got some style attached to the div to make it look sort of button-ish. And it says do it, and its ID is do it. You've seen this before. And then finally, I need a place to output the number. Interestingly, in my specification, it doesn't say where to show the number, the sum of the numbers that have been input. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to create an output area, and it says the sum is, and then I've got a span, and this span exists only for purposes of targeting it with a document get element by ID, because then I can write to it. And you can see that we now have an input field, a do it button, and a place to put our output. So that's sort of the starting point. We've gotten that out of the way. And we can go back and change some of that afterwards if we need to. But at least for now, we know we've got the basics. Now, the other thing we've seen before, and we haven't really described in great detail the reason that this works, and we're going to get to it in Unit 3 of the course. But for now, you've seen code that looks like this, in which we're using getElementById to grab this doIt element, because we need to know when the user clicks on it. And then we can use this. We've assigned it to the variable button. We can use this button on click property to build a function that's going to run when the user clicks the button. So by going this far, I'm going to go ahead and run this and make sure we don't get any errors. So now we've actually got some code that can respond to a button press. It doesn't do anything yet, but we're that far in that we can respond to a button press. So when the user inputs something to the form, we need to be able to grab that, and then we need to store so that we can work with it what the user entered. So what we're going to use is getElementById again, and we're getting the ID nums, which is that input field. We're getting the value of that input field. So whatever goes in here is going to be grabbed by this code, and of course I want to assign it to a variable. Right, so now we've got a variable that should contain anything that somebody types in this field. And in fact, if we want to, we can test that right now. And this is always a good idea to test your code as you build it, so you don't get too far down the road only to realize that perhaps it didn't work. If I just put any old thing in here, it should be gotten by this code assigned to the variable numbers, and it should be output to the console. And let's see, I hit do it, and sure enough, let me change my filters here. There we go. It output to the console. So we know this part works. We don't really need to log that to the console, but we know it's functioning. That's great. Okay, so now we're going to have this string, which contains a bunch of numbers, and we're supposed to sum them. So another thing that we're going to need, if we just look ahead a little bit, is a place to store that sum as we create it. So we've got a variable for our sum, and we've got what is likely to be a set of numbers, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're separated by spaces. Now you'll remember in the last example we looked at the string reference, and we saw this method called split, which will actually take a string and divide the string on some separator to create an array. And that's something that we're going to use right here. We can take the numbers that somebody enters into this line, and we can split them on the space between them to create an array of numbers. And again, if we want to test this at this stage in the game, that's not a bad thing to do. So let's do 1, 2, 3, no, 34 is fine. 33, 4, and 5, and say do it. And here's my array. So far, our code's working okay. And you can see, actually, I must have typed an extra space on the end of this line because it included the empty space at the end. If it broke this string on every space, it actually creates a null string or an empty string at the very end because I entered a space with nothing after it. So at this point, we could start thinking about how to deal with things that aren't numbers, or what if instead of 33, I wrote Bob, and then hit do it, and now you can see I have a non-number in my list. Let's not worry about that yet. Let's get it working for the basic case, and then we can go thinking about how to make it work for the non-basic case. So what we want to do is iterate over that array and visit every element. So we're going to use a for loop, and it's going to iterate the length of the array times. And what do we want to do inside that for loop? Well, basically, we want to take the value of sum, and we want to go num array I. Sum plus equals num array I. And this looks like it should do it. It's going to go over our array. It's going to add each element to the sum. And I guess in the end, the thing we'd like to be able to do is output that to the console so that we can see if it's doing the right thing. So let me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and hit do it. We've seen this before. What did it do? It added all those strings together to make 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not the intended thing. Remember that what this is giving us is an array of strings. In fact, we could have seen that here in the console, that each of these numbers is surrounded by quotes, showing us that it's not really a number, it's a string. So what we're probably going to want to do is one more step, like use parseInt to make sure that this thing is treated like a number. So it's going to parse our string integer into a number, and it's going to add it to the sum, and we're going to run it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the sum is 15, which that looks right. So we've gotten this code in a very short period of time with just a few array and string functions and a loop to be able to add these white space separated numbers and print out the sum. Now what we haven't done is dealt with the situation where one of these isn't a number. Like if I just say Bob, the sum is not a number because parseInt fails when it tries to do that, and then I'm adding not a number to a sum, and that doesn't work. So the one other thing that we're going to want to do is actually check to make sure that what parseInt returns is a number, is a valid value. And we can do that just by adding a conditional around our summing statement. And basically, we want to know that n is something, right? If it's not a number, that's basically a false value. All we really have to test for is n. So let's run this again and see what we get. 1, 2, Bob, 3, 4, 5. And sure enough, it added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it ignored Bob because Bob's not a number. So we're going to add one more piece to this just to make the output a little more pretty, and that is we're going to use getElementById, and we're getting our sum element here, this empty span, and we are setting its inner HTML property to sum. And when I do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sum is 15. It still appears in the console, but it appears here on the web page, which is more useful to a user. So just with the little bit of code that we've learned so far and a few very simple functions, we're actually able to make web pages that do something useful, and there's a lot more to come.